Hey, seventh grade. What was the name of the knight at King Arthur's Round Table who is in charge of all the forts? Fortnite. What was the name of the knight at King Arthur's Round Table who loved to eat meat? Sirloin. What was the name of the fattest knight at King Arthur's Round Table? Circumference. He ate too much pie. Oh, man. Okay. With those good jokes, let's move on to continuing learning about feudalism in Europe. So we're still on slide 17. In the last lesson, we learned about some of the reasons that feudalism developed very strongly in Europe, whereas in Japan, feudalism kind of came and went depending on how strong the emperor was. In Europe, feudalism, once it arrived, it flourished and it became basically permanent, regardless of how strong the kings were. Okay. So yes, under a feudalist system, we have landowning lords. They own a lot of property, a lot of wealth. They usually build manors or castles, and they rule the territories around their castles or manors. And when I say rule, this means they had control over basically everything that went on there. So they were able to control the local market. They were able to control what people were growing on the farms. They were able to control the flow of money. They collected taxes. Right? So under the feudal system, taxes are a really big deal. The way that a feudal lord maintains control over his serfs. Serfs are people who are legally obligated to serve the lord, right? So they, for the most part, swore loyalty to their lord, and by doing that, they became serfs and were legally tied to him, right? So serfs would live on the lord's land. They would farm his fields. They would work in his barns, in his shops if he owned any. And basically everything they produced belonged to the Lord. And in exchange, they were given protection. They were given shelter. They were given care for their children if they were to die, right? The care of the children would fall to the Lord. And then they were also allowed to keep a small share of the crops they grew or a small bit of the products they made for themselves, right? Everything else went to the Lord in the form of taxes. So we need to know one of the distinctions between a serf and a peasant, right? Serfs and peasants have a lot in common in that they are both poor laborers who don't have a lot of rights in medieval Europe, but serfs actually have fewer rights than peasants. Remember, a serf is someone who swears loyalty to the Lord, and because of this, they become legally tied to the Lord and to the Lord's land. This means they're not allowed to move to another place unless the Lord allows it. Right? So if you live on land that belongs to a feudal lord in medieval England, and you want to move to France, well, you're not allowed to do that unless your landowning lord sets you free. Right? So serfdom is very similar to slavery in that you have extremely limited rights. Right? In addition, if you're a serf, you also have to do the work that the Lord wants you to do. So if the Lord wants you to work in the fields, you have to work in the fields. You don't get to choose a different kind of work. If the Lord wants you to fight in his army, you have to fight in his army. You can't choose a different kind of work. Right? And if you disobey or you try to run away, you could be fined, you could be thrown in prison, you could be beaten, or you could even be executed. Right? So serfs were legally obligated to stay on the land that they lived on and to serve the Lord in whatever way the Lord required. All right. Um, so another reason that feudalism did so well in Europe is not only because Europe never had like a single emperor that ruled over everything. Another reason is because of Christianity. Right. So Christianity says that it's important to respect authority figures. And so this gave an opportunity for feudal lords to use Christianity to religiously compel their serfs to obey them. It's kind of a stretch to use the Bible to do that, but a lot of the medieval lords did just that. All right. So the middle of the Dark Ages, Christianity is getting a very strong hold on Europe. And even though the monasteries are places where there's a lot of education and artistic development and innovation going on, outside of the monasteries, there's no educational activity that's being promoted. There's no innovation that's being promoted. Right? And this was true until the church established universities shortly after the year 1000. So for much of the Middle Ages / Dark Ages, Christianity, the monasteries, convents pretty much had a monopoly on learning. And then when the church established universities, this opened up education and the arts to those who could afford to attend universities. Right? So these would be nobles and royals. Right? And so we start to see an expansion of knowledge beyond just the confines of the church around the year 1000. As I alluded to at the beginning of this video with my hilarious jokes, another notable thing about medieval Europe is the role of the knights. So knights are to medieval Europe what samurai were to medieval Japan. They're very similar in a lot of ways, right? So who are these knights? Knights were almost always sons of noble families. It was very, very unlikely that a peasant would ever rise to the level of becoming a knight. Right? Feudal hierarchies were very strict. It just wasn't a realistic possibility for a peasant boy to work his way up to being a knight. Right? So knights were almost always the sons of noblemen. And here's how you become a knight. You're born into a noble family as a boy. And when you are a young boy, you would be sent away to another noble family to live and work in his court, and by doing that, learn to be a knight. And so you would start off as something called a page. As a page, you serve a knight, and by doing that, you learn how to use a sword, you learn how to ride a horse, and you learn manners. So knights follow a code just like samurai did. Samurai follow the Bushido code. Knights follow something called the Code of Chivalry. Right? So the page would learn all about the Code of Chivalry. When he's a teenager, the page becomes a squire. So a squire is like the knight's direct assistant. So a page is kind of like a servant of a knight. A squire is more like an assistant of a knight. Right? And the squire would travel around with the knight and would prepare him for, whatever the knight needed to do, whether it was going to battle, whether it was preparing to enter the court of another nobleman. The squire would help the knight get ready for that. And then finally, the squire would become a knight. And when you become a knight, you swear loyalty to a lord. Now, a knight is not like a peasant. A knight, not like a serf. A knight is legally bound to the lord, but the knights get treated a lot better than the serfs, right? Knights are generally much wealthier than serfs. They don't have to worry about feeding and clothing their families, for example, because the landowning lord, if he's smart, he's going to reward his knight for good service. Right? So if you're a knight, you often get a share of whatever the lord wins if he's victorious in a battle. Right? If you're a really good knight and your lord really likes you, you have a good chance of actually being promoted to a higher noble class. Right? So the way that a lot of the highest ranking noblemen became super high ranking is because they were really successful knights, or their fathers or grandfathers were. Quick note about women here. Medieval Europe, women were their rights were very limited, but noble women did have the opportunity to receive educations. Many noble women became politically powerful. However, under medieval culture, women were considered to be these very delicate, fragile beings that needed protecting. So there was no independence at all. Women had to obey their husbands, had to obey their fathers. And though many women, like I said, became wealthy and powerful, the society as a whole still treated them like they needed to be watched over, taken care of, and they needed to obey men. All right, we got 2 slides left. I don't have time to finish them, so I'm going to stop here and make one more video.